Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And during the month of October, I talk about some particularly spooky literature that has interested me, or in the case of today, on Poetry Thursday, I talk about some fun poetry. That's right, it is once again Poetry Thursday, and so let's talk about some fun, exciting, and thematically spooky poetry. And so today's poem is about a deserted or possibly haunted house. I am referring to Enter This Deserted House by Shel Silverstein. For those who don't know, I've talked about Shel Silverstein on this channel before, and he is a popular children's poetry writer, among other things. So I probably don't need to go into too deep of a summary of who he is. But he was a writer who lived in the 1900s. He started out writing for Playboy, and those kinds of publications, doing pretty well, also working as a cartoonist, and some of his art during that time carries over into the art when he started writing for children. But after he finished that, he started working on other things such as The Giving Tree, The Missing Piece, Where the Sidewalk Ends, a Light in the Attic, among many other things, and he became very well known for his poetry work. I believe that a lot of people talk about his poetry in elementary school, middle school. It's a good way to get an introduction into the world of poetry. And that's how I found out about him, and I've talked about some of his poems on this channel before. Not too heavy in the analysis part, but it's still worth talking about because, if we're sharing poetry with children, we should talk about what that poetry means as well as the more complex poetry that you find with your Robert Frost and your Allen Ginsbergs and such. So without further ado, let's talk about Enter This Deserted House. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. Enter this deserted house. But please walk softly as you do. Frogs dwell here and crickets too. Ain't no ceiling, only blue. Jays dwell here and sunbeams too. Floors are flowers, take a few. Ferns grow here and daisies too. Swoosh, whoosh, to wit, to woo. Bats dwell here and hoot owls too. Ha ha ha, hee hee, hoo hoo. Gnomes dwell here and goblins too. And my child, I thought you knew. I dwell here, and so do you. And so that was Enter This Deserted House. In terms of analysis, there's not a whole lot to talk about because it's mostly a short poem, but there are a few things of note that are worth talking about. In terms of, narrative, it's just an authority figure talking to a child about the house in which they live, which we don't find out until the end of the poem. We find out that there are frogs in this house and crickets. There's no ceiling. There's a bunch of flowers growing. It's probably dilapidated. There's bats and owls and gnomes and goblins, which are spooky. And so the poem ends with saying, I dwell here and so do you. This is a haunted house of sorts. The narrator and this child are ghosts within it. We never find out why, but that's worth noting. The poem follows a pretty standard like AA, BB, CC, DD, EE, FF kind of line where it's couplets like saying, but please walk softly as you do. Frogs dwell here and crickets too. Only blue, sunbeams too. To wit, to woo, hoot owls too. So pretty simple that you see in children's poetry. Nothing too complex, just enough to excite the children and get them more interested in poetry. But one thing I also like about this poem is his use of onomatopoeias, which again it's common in children's poetry as a way of just symbolizing what's going on within the poem. He says, swoosh whoosh, to wit to woo, bats dwell here and hoot owls too, highlighting the sound that bats and owls make. And then ha ha ha, hee hee hoo hoo, gnomes dwell here and goblins too, which is always fun to say. But again, like the sound that gnomes or goblins might make, which also gives it a more of a creepy atmosphere, depending on how you choose to say those onomatopoeias. Like they can be happy and light, or they can be dark and spooky, or however you want to do that. But the last thing worth noting is the end of the poem, where Shel Silverstein says, "And my child, I thought you knew, I dwell here and so do you." You could read this as two ways. One, a ghost becoming aware that they are a ghost, or like an authority figure trying to scare this child by saying, there's different, types of creatures in this house, and this is the same house in which we live. Or something like that. Another joke I've heard recently is like, Dad, I want to go to a haunted house, and the dad saying, what's wrong with the one we have? So it's like it's trying to like scare or like frighten children. But you could also interpret it as like people just coming to realize that they are ghosts in this haunted house, that they are another spooky element of this place. Something to consider. They don't even have to be ghosts. They could be wolves or dogs or stray cats or something like that have just found their way in. And this could be like Ursula K. Le Guin's The Wife's Story, where we find out that the narrators are not actually human. They are some sort of ghost or wild animal. Which is another interesting aspect of the poem. Shel Silverstein probably didn't intend for us to go this deep in this poem, but it is worth talking about here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Enter This Deserted House, a pretty light poem by Shel Silverstein, but one that, is fun to talk about during Halloween. We shouldn't just talk about the heavy and the complex poetry. We should talk about, the lighter side of things as well, because it's part of the canon of poetry that exists out there. So worth talking about. I'll link to it in the description so that you can read it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem, Shel Silverstein, if they don't already know, and Poetry Thursday if they want to lean more heavily into that. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and haunted house travels. Farewell.